and modernise our system of national security.
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak on this urgent debate related to the Kitteridge report on the Government Communications Security Bureau. The GCSB is a very unusual agency in New Zealand, and to some extent it's under the control of the New Zealand government, and to some extent it isn't. And that is, I think, where a lot of the problem arises. I think it's pretty illuminating as a starting point to talk about, to quote from David Lange. David Lange was Prime Minister, of course, and responsible for the GCSB some years ago. And when Nicky Hager wrote his book Secret Power, exposing the role of the GCSB, David Lange had this to say in the preface that he wrote for the book. He said about the satellite station at Waihopai that the GCSB built, the New Zealand government built, he said, quote David Lange, "We even went to the length of building a satellite station at Waihopai. But it was not until I read this book that I had any idea that we had been committed to an international integrated electronic network." So the Prime Minister of New Zealand, at the time responsible for the GCSB, at the time the Waihopai spying station was built, had no idea what the purpose of the station was for, because the GCSB did not tell him, because it's a secretive agency that works mostly for the US spy agencies rather than the New Zealand government, and that's just a fact. The thing that Mr Lange goes on to say in this book, he says an astonishing number of people have told him, that is Nicky Hager, have told him things that I, as Prime Minister in charge of the intelligence services, was never told. The Prime Minister was kept in the dark. And David Lange goes on to say, "It is an outrage that I and other ministers were told so little, and this raises the question of to whom those concerned saw themselves ultimately answerable." And the truth is, of course, that the GCSB sees itself as ultimately answerable to the US spy agencies, and that's the problem, is that the GCSB is a rogue agency. It doesn't report to anybody. The Prime Minister doesn't know what's going on at the GCSB, as the report illustrates. The GCSB acts illegally, as the report illustrates. That is, as I think Bill English was just saying, it didn't have to pay very close attention to its compliance with the law, to put it mildly. It acted illegally. It's an agency which doesn't really have any parliamentary oversight. There is no parliamentary committee which looks over the intelligence services. There's the Intelligence and Security Committee, but it doesn't have any power to see what the GCSB is doing. There's the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, who has a woeful record of not providing any proper oversight of what the SIS and the GCSB are up to. And it means that the GCSB and the SIS are free to do as they want. And what they want to do is engage in unlawful activities, it turns out, as we've discovered from this report. The reason why this matters so much is because it goes to the heart of fundamental rights and freedoms for New Zealanders. When you think about it, do you want to live in a society where you have these rogue state agencies looking at all of your email? You have these rogue state agencies opening all of your correspondence, spying on you, listening to all of your phone calls, monitoring all of your internet use, breaking into your house and putting bugs in your house, because these are the activities that these agencies undertake lawfully or unlawfully. These are the kinds of activities that the GCSB and SIS actually do. So ordinary New Zealanders, if you were to think about it, what kind of bar would you have that would make it acceptable for the state to so breach your fundamental rights and freedoms that the state could break into your house, put a bug in your house, that the state could monitor all of your emails, all of your conversations on the telephone? The bar has to be very, very high if you are to let the state engage in those kinds of activities. And the problem is that because nobody is watching what the GCSB and SIS get up to, nobody knows whether the bar is being met for the SIS and the GCSB activities. And there is insufficient oversight, as this report amply demonstrates, to double-check on the people that are supposed to be watching. So there is a minister, in theory, who's supposed to be watching what goes on inside the GCSB and the SIS. Now, the minister is clearly either asleep at the wheel or just doesn't care what's going on inside the GCSB and the SAS and is letting them get on with their business. And from my point of view, when you're talking about fundamental rights and freedoms, having a Prime Minister who is asleep at the wheel in his job as the only democratic official having oversight over the GCSB and the SAS, that is unacceptable. There is only one democratically elected official who has oversight over the security agencies, and that is the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister has manifestly failed to do his job. That is his job, and he has completely failed to do it. Now, obviously, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security has failed to do his job as well. There's no question about that. It is as plain as day. This also cuts to the Prime Minister's role as head of the SIS, and not only the SAS but the GCSB. Let's remember that the warrants, the interception warrants that were signed off so that these illegal activities that the GCSB did so that they could take place were signed by John Key. John Key signed the interception warrants as Minister for SAS, and then his other ministry that he's responsible for illegally implemented these implementation warrants. That is the basic truth. Now we hear the shouting from the minister who doesn't like the truth, as usual, but I'm sorry, Mr Jerry Brownlee, it is just the fact that's in the report. It is simply in the report that the Prime Minister signed the interception warrants that were illegally implemented by the GCSB. And you don't like it, but it happens to be true. So the Prime Minister Mr Jerry Brownlee brings up the previous government. I fully agree that the previous government is as culpable because they put through the legislation which the National Party supported, as did the National Party support it. You voted for it, didn't you, Mr Brownlee?
Order. Order.
Yes, that member voted for it. And so the National Party voted for the legislation as well as the Labor Party who pushed it through, even though the Green Party at the time warned that if you set up spying agencies that don't have oversight, they will abuse their rights. And it has become so. What this report shows is that if you set up an agency like this which does not have proper oversight, it will abuse its rights, and that is exactly what it's done, to abuse the rights and freedoms of New Zealanders rather than protecting them. And that is a tragedy. I was saddened to hear the Deputy Prime Minister criticise Section 14 of the GCSB Act, and I think it's important to read out Section 14. Interceptions not to target domestic communications. Neither director nor an employee of the Bureau nor a person acting on behalf of the Bureau may authorise or take any action for the purpose of intercepting the communications of a person who is a New Zealand citizen or permanent resident. Parliament chose to put a very clear legislative direction in place. It is in black and white. The GCSB and the National Party come along now and say, oh, it's not very clear. Anyone reading this section of the Act, it is patently clear that what the GCSB did was illegal and unlawful. It is in black and white. You only have to read the Act. Parliament purposely chose to constrain the GCSB and prevent them from spying on New Zealanders, and then the GCSB, while John Key was supposed to be providing protection, the GCSB went ahead and spied on New Zealanders and broke the law. So, Mr Speaker, it seems to me that we need a fundamental reform of the oversight of these agencies and the agencies themselves. If we are to have these kinds of draconian, authoritarian, dictatorial powers in the hands of a state agency that breach the highest levels of our rights and our freedoms, then there needs to be very strong oversight. There needs to be very powerful justification for any agency to exercise these kinds of powers, and there needs to be very powerful oversight. And so far we have not had that oversight, and surprise, surprise, the agency which is not being monitored by the democratically elected officials who have that job has abused its power and acted illegally to spy on New Zealanders in spite of that. It seems to me that if we are to protect freedom and democracy in our society, we have to keep the spy agencies in check in order to protect those fundamental rights and freedoms. The present government has clearly failed to do that, and based on this report, it clearly appears that the previous government failed to do that, to keep the spy agencies in check, and the Green Party will keep pushing to make sure that happens.
Andrew Williams.